Some houses are silent because nobody lives in them, and some houses are silent because there is far too much that nobody is allowed to say out loud. Josie Ward was 29 years old, a piano tuner by trade, and that morning she stood in front of an oak door on Prince Street with her father's toolbox in her hand. They had hired her to fix a piano that had been silent for 22 years. They gave her exactly 3 instructions. Don't ask questions, don't go up to the second floor, and never mention this to anyone. She had been doing this work for almost 10 years. She knew how to press her ear against the case and tell how long an instrument had been abandoned, under what circumstances the lid had been closed, and how much pain the last person to touch it had been carrying. But she had never learned how to read her own life that way. There were $312 in her wallet that morning. On the kitchen table of her basement apartment sat a denial letter from the insurance company, and in the next room slept an 8-year-old girl she had no idea how she was going to save. She should have walked away. She should have listened to the cold feeling crawling up the back of her neck when the man in the dark suit opened the door without offering a single word of greeting. The same man who would later hand her an offer no one on earth was allowed to refuse, and no one on earth would dare accept. But Josie Ward stepped inside. She set her toolbox down on the marble floor, pulled back the dust cover, and lifted the lid. She had no idea that someone had been waiting 6 years for her to open it. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so I'll know you stayed with me all the way to the end. Share it with someone you think needs to be reminded that the most precious things in this world can never be bought with money. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because every week we have a new story waiting for you. Inside the piano case lay 22 years of dust. Josie folded the cover and set it aside, and the first thing she did wasn't touch the keys, but bend down to inspect the cast iron frame. To someone outside the trade, an abandoned piano looked dead. Josie looked at the frame. The cast iron frame was what carried nearly 20 tons of tension from 230 steel strings, and if it cracked, the piano was finished. No one could save it, even if every string and every felt hammer were replaced. This frame was still intact. No cracks, no warping, not a single patch of rust that had eaten deep into the metal, which meant that through 22 years of lying silent beneath a cloth in this cold room, the structure inside it had kept bearing the strain. No one had simply bothered to bring the strings back under tension. Josie sat down on the bench, wiped her hands on her pant legs, and began. She removed the top lid, took off the music desk, and used a flashlight to inspect the soundboard from end to end. 3 strings in the bass register had snapped and curled in on themselves like tangled hair. The felt hammers were hard as stone, their striking surfaces polished smooth from being hit over and over in the same places, then left untouched for decades without anyone regulating them. She wrote a few lines in her notebook. Then she worked. For 4 hours, no one said a word to her. The man in the suit who had opened the door for her at the beginning had disappeared long ago. Every so often, footsteps passed through the hallway outside, then faded away, and no one leaned in to look. The room was so large that every time she tapped a tuning pin against a string, the sound echoed back from the ceiling as though a second person were working somewhere else in the room. Josie paid no attention. When she worked, the whole world narrowed down to a single string in her left ear. She tightened, she struck, she listened, she adjusted by 0.5% of a tone, and she listened again. The first A came precisely into pitch close to noon. She straightened her back, rolled her neck, and at that exact moment she heard wheels rolling across the marble floor in the hallway, accompanied by another sound, soft and steady, one pulse every few seconds. An oxygen concentrator. The man being pushed into the room had to be close to 80. He sat in an electric wheelchair, a thin oxygen tube looped over both ears, his legs covered by a plaid blanket. The person pushing him positioned him at the far end of the room, then stepped out and closed the door. He didn't say hello. He simply watched her for a long moment before speaking, his voice rough and thin as paper. "You're working too slowly." Josie didn't look up. "Still turning the pin," she answered. "Are you paying by the hour or by the piano?" The old man went silent for a beat. "By the piano." "Then it doesn't matter whether I work slowly or quickly." She struck a key, listened, then adjusted it a little more. Only then did the old man truly look at her. It was the look of someone who had spent 79 years accustomed to saying one sentence and having 3 people immediately run off to carry it out, and who had just met someone who didn't run. "They tell me there are electronic tuners now," he said. "You plug one in, and it tells you which note is wrong, several times faster. Why don't you use one?" Josie set the tuning lever down. She turned fully toward him and looked at him for the first time since he'd entered the room. Because a machine only knows what a correct note is supposed to be, she said. It doesn't know how this piano used to be played. It doesn't know whether the person who sat here used to press harder with the left hand than the right. It doesn't know that the C in the third octave was played so often that the felt wore down more on one side. Plug in a machine, and 2 hours from now this piano will be correct. It'll be correct in exactly the same way as every other piano in the world. It'll sound like a toy telephone. She shrugged. If all you need is for it to make the right sounds, call one of those kids with a machine. It'll be finished by Friday. But if you want it to sound again the way it used to sound, then you have to let me sit here and listen. And listening takes time. A long silence followed. Then the old man laughed. It was a wet laugh, rising from somewhere deep in his chest, and it couldn't make it all the way out. It broke in the middle and turned into a long coughing fit. He lifted a hand to his chest, his trembling fingers tightening around the wheelchair armrest. Josie started halfway to her feet. He waved her back down. When the coughing finally passed, he let out a long breath and said, "I don't pay for fast. I pay for right." Josie sat back down on the bench. A question had been resting on the tip of her tongue for the entire 4 hours she'd been there. A house with marble floors, a man in a suit opening the door, a 1937 Steinway worth as much as her entire apartment, and yet the piano had been left mute beneath a cloth for 22 years. People didn't forget something like that. They chose not to touch it. She swallowed the question. She'd been given 3 instructions, and the first was not to ask questions. The old man rolled his chair closer, stopping about 2 steps from the piano and no nearer. He stared at the keys the way someone might look at an old acquaintance they hadn't seen in years, and weren't entirely sure they wanted to see again. "Come back Tuesday," he said. Then he turned the chair around and left, the sound of the oxygen machine growing fainter along the hallway. Josie remained still for a long time in the room that had fallen silent once more. Then she picked up the tuning lever and went back to work. The apartment in Somerville sat half a level below ground, which meant that when you looked out the kitchen window, all you could see were the lower legs of people walking past and the wheels of bicycles. Josie got home close to 7 o'clock that evening, carrying the smell of piano dust and old felt in her hair. Poppy was lying on her stomach on the floor, doing her homework on the lid of her grandfather's old toolbox, because the apartment didn't have a dining table. She was 8 years old and had long since grown used to treating that wooden box as a table, a chair, and a place where she could divide her sandwich in half and save 1 piece for breakfast the next morning without anyone having to remind her. She looked up and proudly announced that her teacher had let them draw their favorite animal that day, and she'd drawn a giraffe because giraffes had 7 vertebrae in their necks, exactly like people did. Her teacher had said so. Did Mom believe that? Josie said she did. Then she went into the kitchen and saw that the envelope was still lying exactly where she'd left it on the counter that morning, after reading the first 3 lines and having to leave for work. Now she read the whole thing, and she realized she'd misunderstood it all day. She'd assumed they had denied the request because of money, because her insurance plan was too cheap, because her share of the cost was too high, because some number somewhere didn't match. But there wasn't a single number in the letter. There was a phrase, printed in italics, sitting between 2 long paragraphs filled with words no ordinary person would ever read all the way through. Insufficient medical indication at the present time. Beneath it was a polite explanation. The review board noted that the pediatric patient's condition was currently stable within the range, appropriate for observation, and recommended continued periodic monitoring, with reconsideration upon any significant clinical change. Josie read that sentence 3 times. Then she understood what it meant. It meant her daughter wasn't weak enough yet to be saved. It meant that if she wanted approval, she had to wait. Wait until there was a significant change. She set the paper down very gently, as though putting it down too hard might break it open, and let the meaning inside spill all over the kitchen. Out in the other room, Poppy was still reading her homework aloud, her tiny voice getting a word or 2 wrong, and then correcting itself. Josie opened her phone and called the customer service number. The first call lasted 26 minutes, most of it spent listening to hold music. The woman who finally answered had a very pleasant voice, called her Miss Ward, repeated the exact words from the letter. And when Josie asked what counted as a significant change, she said that determination fell under the authority of the medical department. On the second call, Josie reached someone else, just as pleasant, who also called her Miss Ward, and this person told her that she absolutely had the right to file an appeal, and that processing usually took between 30 and 45 business days. Josie asked how many real days 45 business days meant. There was a pause on the other end before the person said approximately 9 weeks. On the third call, Josie asked to speak to someone who actually had the authority to make a decision. She was transferred twice, and eventually a man answered. He wasn't as pleasant as the first two people, but he was more honest. He said, "Miss Ward, I'll be direct so you don't waste your time. Your daughter's case will be approved. It absolutely will be approved, just not now. Our system is designed to intervene when intervention becomes necessary." Josie asked what happened if, by the time intervention became necessary, it was already too late. The man was silent for quite a while. Then he said he was very sorry, and that it was a question he wasn't permitted to answer. Josie set the phone face down on the table. In the bottom drawer, beneath several electric bills, there was another sheet of paper she didn't need to open, because she already knew it by heart. $61,000. People tended to think of it as Elliot's debt, the debt of a man who had died, and dead people were supposed to carry their debts into the ground with them, but they didn't. It was her debt. She had signed for it. She'd been 27 that year, standing in the fourth-floor hallway of the hospital close to midnight, when someone handed her a stack of papers and explained very quickly that the covered portion had reached its limit, that continuing the treatment plan required someone to co-sign the loan, and that without one, they would have no choice but to transition him to palliative care. Josie had asked what palliative care meant. They explained it to her. She signed right there in the hallway without sitting down, pressing the papers against the wall, using a pen she'd borrowed from a nurse walking past. She signed all 3 places marked with little crosses, handed the pen back, and said thank you. 4 months later, Elliot died. The loan remained. It stayed with her for 2 years, 1 letter every month, and she'd learned how to look at that envelope without feeling her heart begin to race. She turned off the kitchen light and walked back into the other room. Poppy had put away her homework, tucked her pencils into their box, and was sitting on the lid of the toolbox swinging her legs. She asked, "Mom, that house with the big piano, do you have to go back there Tuesday?" Josie said yes. Poppy nodded thoughtfully, as though she'd calculated the matter very carefully, then said, "I get out early Tuesday, and Miss Marla has to go to the dentist again so she can't watch me, so can I come with you? I promise I'll sit quietly. I'll bring my book too." Josie looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said yes. On Tuesday morning, a light drizzle hung over the city, the kind of early March rain in Boston that wasn't enough to soak your clothes but was enough to make you cold. Josie gave her daughter exactly 3 instructions on the way there. Sit in one place. Don't touch anything. If anyone asks you something, answer politely and leave it at that. Poppy nodded 3 times with great seriousness, clutching her book and pencil box tightly against her chest, and kept her promise for about 40 minutes. The man in the suit opened the door, looked down at the child, then looked at Josie, and said nothing. He simply stepped aside to let mother and daughter enter. Josie settled Poppy into the velvet armchair in the corner of the room, as far from the piano as possible, then went to work. She had already replaced the 3 broken strings from the previous visit, and today came the hardest part, voicing the felt. She was holding a 3-needle voicing tool, working it into the face of a hammer to soften the hardened felt, when she heard the familiar sound of wheels rolling through the hallway and the quiet rhythm of the oxygen machine. Josie straightened. She had spent the entire morning rehearsing an apology in her head, but the old man didn't look at her. He looked directly at the armchair in the corner, where an 8-year-old girl sat with her knees drawn up, and he stopped his chair. "What's your name?" he asked. "Poppy Ward, sir," the girl answered, sitting up straight as though she were in class. "Poppy means the poppy flower," the old man said. "Did you know that?" She said she did, her mother had told her, because when her grandmother was still alive, she loved arranging flowers. Then Poppy fell silent, remembering what her mother had told her, and pressed her lips together. The old man sat quietly for a while. He looked at the book in the girl's lap, at the pencil box, at the 2 small feet in faded sneakers swinging several inches above the floor. Then he turned to Josie. "Would you bring her over here?" Josie set the 3-needle tool down on the piano lid. She crossed the room, picked Poppy up, and didn't put her down. She stood right there beside the wheelchair, close enough that all she had to do was lift her arms and move the child away. The old man seemed to understand that, and he showed no reaction. He simply raised a trembling finger and pointed to the small black lever mounted on the right armrest. "This is called a control stick," he said. "Push it forward, and the chair moves forward. Pull it back, and the chair goes backward. Tilt it left, and the chair turns left. Do you understand?" Poppy looked at the control, then looked at her mother. Josie hesitated for exactly 1 beat. Then she set the girl on the wide edge of the seat beside the old man, keeping one hand firmly around her shoulder, and said, "All right, just push gently." Poppy placed her index finger on the lever and pushed. The wheelchair moved forward by half a hand's width and stopped. The girl jerked her hand back as though she'd been shocked, then burst into laughter. She pushed it a second time, longer now, and the chair rolled toward the middle of the living room, past the piano, past the chair where the cover had been neatly folded. Then Poppy tilted the lever left, and the wheelchair made a wide circle around the low table in the center of the room, slow and steady, humming softly across the marble floor. The girl laughed, and the sound rose through the tall room and echoed back from the ceiling. She turned toward the old man, opened her mouth as wide as she could, and pointed to the gap in her lower teeth. "Look," she said, "I just lost this tooth. It came out Saturday. I was eating bread, and it fell right into my hand." The old man tilted his head and peered at the gap with an expression of great concentration. "When one falls out like this, a new one grows in," he said. "You know that, don't you?" Poppy nodded eagerly and announced that the new tooth would grow twice as big as the old one, because a classmate had told her that second teeth were always twice as big. Then she added, with complete certainty, "So I'll be able to bite into a whole apple." The old man laughed. It wasn't the polite laugh from before, and it wasn't the wet laugh that had broken into a coughing fit on Friday. This time it was real laughter, rising from deep in his belly, his shoulders shaking, the deep creases around his eyes loosening completely. Josie stood there watching, and she had the strange feeling that the people somewhere else in this house, the people in suits who moved through the hallways without ever looking in, had probably stopped in their tracks at the sound they had just heard. The old man raised a hand and wiped the corner of his eye. Then he turned to Josie and spoke, his voice once again rough and thin as before. "You're a good mother, Miss Ward. That's a rare thing." Josie didn't know what to say. She thanked him and started to lift Poppy down. The old man waved his hand and told her to leave the girl where she was. Then he looked out into the open space before him, toward the great window overlooking rain-soaked Prince Street, and continued, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Josie or to himself. "Most people get so busy building empires that they forget who they're building them for. They spend 40 years building, then turn around and discover there's no one left in the house to sit beside them." Josie remained silent. In her arms, Poppy had already grown bored with the grown-up conversation. She leaned forward, placed her finger on the control stick again, and looked up at the old man. "Sir, can I drive one more lap? Just one. This time I'll go past the piano and come straight back here." The following Thursday, someone called Josie to a different address. Not the house on Prince Street, but a restaurant on Hanover Street, about 3 blocks away, the kind of place with a faded wooden sign out front, and an interior that always seemed one shade darker than the daylight outside. They told her there was an old upright piano on the second floor. Nothing especially important, but the old man wanted it to make sound again. Josie arrived close to noon. The front door was still locked, and a waiter led her around through the kitchen entrance. She passed through the cold kitchen, then the wine storage room, and was just about to step into the hallway when the waiter ahead of her suddenly stopped, raised a hand to signal her, then took one step back and stood perfectly still. Josie stopped too. Through a doorway left open by about the width of a hand, she could see the dining room beyond. Every chair had been turned upside down on top of the tables except for one table in the center. A man around 50 was standing beside it, not sitting, both hands held in front of his stomach, and he was talking. He spoke quickly, stumbling over his words, repeating the same phrase every few sentences. He talked about the winter, about how slow business had been, about his son going to college in Providence, about how next month he would have the money. He definitely would. Sitting across from him was a much younger man, maybe 34 or 35, with black hair cut very close, and he wasn't saying anything at all. He sat straight-backed, both hands resting lightly on the tabletop, and he let the other man keep talking until there was nothing left to say. The silence afterward stretched so long that Josie found herself struggling to breathe on the man's behalf. Then the seated man finally spoke, and his voice was low, slow, even, no louder than the other man's had been, yet somehow the entire room seemed to lean toward it. He asked, "How much?" The standing man gave him a number. The seated man nodded once, then said, "Wipe it." The standing man froze. He asked again, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" The seated man repeated himself in the same tone, "Wipe it all. You don't owe anything anymore. Go home and sleep." The standing man began thanking him. He thanked him 2 or 3 times, lifting one hand as though he meant to take the younger man's hand, and Josie saw his shoulders trembling, but the seated man didn't offer his hand. He waited until the other man had finished thanking him, then placed his right hand on the tabletop, palm facing upward, and said nothing else. The standing man stared at that open hand. Then he understood. The understanding passed across his face like a cold wind. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a ring of keys, and held on to it for a long moment before placing it into the other man's palm. The seated man closed his hand around the keys, slipped them into his pocket, and only then stood up. He thanked the man, and even pulled the chair back to make room for him to pass. No one raised his voice. No one touched anyone. The man around 50 walked out of the restaurant on his own 2 feet, standing straight, without a single mark on his body. And he had just lost the store that had supported him for 20 years. Josie stood behind that narrow opening in the doorway, and she understood something she wouldn't forget for many months afterward. That man hadn't forgiven him. He had simply changed the punishment into another form, one that didn't require anyone to bleed, one that left no marks for the police to see, and one that hurt for far longer. She also understood what kind of house she had been walking into. That afternoon, she returned to Prince Street to finish voicing the felt. Aurelio was already sitting in the living room when she arrived. He asked whether she'd seen anything that morning on Hanover Street. Josie said she'd seen an old upright piano with every string rusted through, and it would probably need a complete restringing. The old man watched her for a moment, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile a person wore when he knew he'd just been given a very careful answer. He said, "The boy's name is Nico, my grandson." Josie said, "I didn't ask." "I know you didn't," he replied. Then he fell silent for a moment, drew 3 breaths through the oxygen tube, and continued. "He has 300 men willing to die for him, Miss Ward. 300. I've counted them. But do you know how many of those 300 would dare sit down at a dinner table and tell him he's wrong? None. Not one. People are afraid of him. They obey him. They do everything he tells them to do. And not one of them will sit and eat with him for longer than 40 minutes. Josie kept working and didn't answer. The old man said, "Everyone is missing something. The wisdom of living is finding the person who happens to be missing exactly what you have too much of." Josie struck a key, listened, then adjusted the tuning pin. She said, "It's a little early in the day for philosophy. It's only 2 o'clock. The old man chuckled softly. Then he said, with the same calm tone someone might use to discuss the weather, "Dr. Ellen Novak." Josie's hand stopped. She looked up. The old man was watching her, and there was nothing triumphant in his eyes, only the tired expression of someone who had grown used to knowing everything and no longer found any pleasure in it. Josie rose from the bench. She said, "I haven't said that name to anyone in this house. Not one person. If you could stand up, I'd tell you to stay the hell away from my daughter's business." The old man didn't take offense. He only said, "Everything in this house is my business, Miss Ward." Then he turned his chair and left, leaving Josie standing alone in the middle of the room, with the tuning lever still clenched tightly in her hand. Josie finished the piano over 2 more sessions, and on both of those days the old man never came downstairs. They told her he was tired. On the final afternoon, she finished regulating the upper register, played a rising arpeggio from the lowest notes to the highest, and the 1937 Steinway gave voice to a sound it hadn't made in 22 years. She sat there and listened as it slowly faded through the tall room. Then she closed the lid, packed her tools, and they paid her at the door, the full amount, in an envelope, without anyone saying another word. She thought that was the end of it. 11 days later, she was tuning a piano in the music room of an elementary school over in Charlestown when she saw the news on her phone. Aurelio Castellani, 79 years old, had died in his sleep at his home on Prince Street. The notice was only 4 lines long, and 3 of those lines were about the concrete company. Josie read it a second time, put her phone away, then sat motionless in front of the keys for a long while, unable to remember which note she'd just been tuning. She hadn't been close to him. She'd been angry with him the last time they'd spoken, and she'd never taken back what she'd said. But he had truly laughed with her daughter, the kind of laugh that entire house seemed not to have heard in a very long time. And he'd let an 8-year-old girl drive his wheelchair around the living room 3 times, while the men in suits stood in the hallway outside, barely daring to breathe. That was enough for Josie to borrow Miss Marla's black coat and attend the funeral. St. Leonard Church was so crowded that people had to stand all the way out onto the front steps. Josie counted silently and gave up somewhere around 400. There were men who had come from New York, several cars with out-of-state plates parked along Hanover Street, and even an elderly man with a cane who had to be helped inside by 3 people while everyone else stood as he passed. Josie remained at the back of the church, close to a column, in a place where she could leave at any moment. She hadn't brought Poppy. After the service, people formed a line to offer their condolences, and the line stretched through almost the entire length of the church. Nico Castellani stood at the front beside the coffin, dressed in a black suit, and he remained there for a full hour without sitting down once. One person after another came forward. Some shook his hand. Some bent down and kissed the back of it. A ritual Josie had only ever seen in movies, and hadn't thought anyone still performed in real life. Some said a few words. Some said nothing at all, and Josie stood at the back of the church, watching for that entire hour, until she finally noticed the strangest thing about the whole morning. There was an empty circle around that man. No one stood beside him. No one stayed shoulder to shoulder with him. People stepped forward, touched his hand for exactly 2 seconds, then moved away. 400 people crowded into one church, and not one of them remained beside him for more than 2 seconds. There was no one there for him to lean on, no one to hand him a bottle of water, no one to place a hand on his back the way people usually did for someone who had just lost his grandfather. He stood alone in the middle of 400 people. Josie remembered what the old man had told her in the living room that afternoon. The part about 300 men willing to die for him, and not one willing to sit through a meal with him for more than 40 minutes. And now she saw those words take shape before her in geometry. Near the end of the line stood a man close to 60, silver at both temples, wearing a suit more expensive than every other suit in the church. He shook Nico's hand. Then he didn't let go immediately. He held on for one extra beat, only one, and said something very quietly. Josie was too far away to hear it, but she saw the younger man's jaw tighten once and then relax instantly, so quickly that anyone who blinked would have missed it. The silver-haired man released his hand, smiled, patted him twice on the shoulder, and walked away. He was the only person that morning who touched Nico for longer than 2 seconds. Josie left before the procession departed for the cemetery. She crossed the parking lot behind the church, with both hands tucked into the pockets of the borrowed coat, trying to figure out which train she could still catch back to Somerville, when someone stepped in front of her and blocked her path. A young man in a suit, the kind of man she'd seen many times over the past 3 weeks without ever once learning his name. He didn't greet her. He simply held out a thick ivory card with only 3 embossed lines. Miss Ward, Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. Josie looked at the card but didn't reach for it. She said, "I finished the piano. They paid me. I don't have any business there anymore." The man in the suit replied, "It isn't about the piano, ma'am." Then he placed the card in her hand, gave her one small nod, and walked away. On Thursday morning, she arrived 5 minutes before 10 o'clock, and they led her in a different direction. Instead of taking her into the living room with the piano, they turned left, walked the length of a hallway, and stopped at a pair of double doors that Josie had never once seen anyone open during the 3 weeks she'd worked in that house. Inside was the dead man's study. The stack of papers on his desk was still exactly where he'd left it, his reading glasses folded neatly on top, and a wooden smoking pipe sat nearby, untouched for weeks. There were 3 men in the room. One sat behind the desk. The other 2 stood, one holding a document case, the other holding nothing at all. The man behind the desk was Nico Castellani. He pointed to the chair across from him. Josie sat down, placed her toolbox at her feet, and noticed a thin scar running through his left eyebrow, the kind of scar so old that it had faded lighter than the skin around it. He didn't ask how she was. He said, "Thank you for coming," then went straight to the point. "My grandfather left a will. His legitimate assets include the operating rights to a harbor terminal on the south side, the entire concrete company, and 3 buildings downtown. He didn't leave them to me. He placed everything into a civil trust." Josie said, "I don't understand what a trust is." The man holding the document case stepped forward half a pace and explained. He said it was a fund supervised by the state court, administered by an independent attorney, and that the beneficiary would receive the assets only after fulfilling the conditions written on the page exactly as stated, not 1 day sooner, not 1 word differently. He added that this kind of arrangement was common in families with substantial wealth, and that it was designed so no one could interfere with it in any way. Josie understood immediately what he was carefully avoiding saying. She looked directly at the man behind the desk and said, "So you can't get it using your usual methods?" A brief silence settled over the room. The man holding nothing shifted his weight slightly. Nico Castellani's expression didn't change at all. He said, "That's right. I can't. My grandfather placed it beyond my reach very carefully, and he did it while he was still clear-minded enough that no one can challenge it. If I want it, I have to follow the words on the page like anyone else in this country." Then he told her the condition. The beneficiary must enter into a legal marriage and maintain a stable, verifiable family life for 12 consecutive months. The attorney administering the trust will certify it. After 12 months, the entire estate transfers without conditions. Josie was about to make some sarcastic remark about wealthy men who couldn't manage to find wives for themselves, But the attorney continued, and what he said next was the part that mattered. He said the will also contained a contingency clause. If, during those 12 months, the court received evidence and determined that the marriage was fraudulent, created for the purpose of obtaining the trust, then the entire estate would immediately pass to the alternate beneficiary. There would be no need to wait until the end of the term. There would be no appeal. Josie asked who the alternate beneficiary was. The attorney glanced quickly toward the desk. Nico said the name, Salvatore Renzi. Josie didn't know the name. She only knew that when it was spoken, both men standing in the room lowered their eyes to the floor. She asked, "So what do you want from me?" "People hired me to tune a piano. I finished it." And that was when Nico Castellani finally did the thing he'd been sitting there waiting all morning to do. He pulled a sheet of paper from the file, turned to the correct page, and pushed it across the desk toward her. He didn't say a word. Josie lowered her eyes. It was a page from the will, typed, with the seal of a notary office stamped in the lower corner. The upper half contained several lines about operating rights to the harbor terminal, acreage, and parcel numbers. The lower half was much the same, and directly in the middle, in the third paragraph, surrounded by words and numbers she didn't understand, was her name. Josephine Marie Ward, complete, carefully typed, including her middle name, the middle name even Elliot had rarely used when he was alive. Josie read it 3 times. Then she looked up. She said, "I met your grandfather exactly 5 times in my life. We spoke 4 times. Altogether, it couldn't have been more than an hour." Nico nodded. He said, "I know. I had people verify everything." Then he continued, and for the first time there was something different in his voice. It wasn't softer, only more direct. "Don't think I chose you. I didn't choose anyone. I saw this name for the first time 9 days ago, in my attorney's office, at the same time as 6 other people. I asked them whether another name could be substituted. It can't. My grandfather wrote it very tightly. If the person named in the will refuses, then the condition is considered unfulfilled, and 31 months from now, everything goes to Salvatore Renzi." He paused. He said the last sentence without looking at her. "I was assigned to this just like you were. The only difference is that I don't have anywhere else to go." Josie sat in silence. She thought about the sheet of paper lying on the kitchen counter in Somerville, with the italicized phrase in the middle. She thought about the number 61,000. She thought about the pen she'd borrowed from the nurse in the 4th-floor hallway. Then she stood, and the chair scraped harshly across the wooden floor. She said, "I know what you do for a living. Everyone in this neighborhood knows. They just don't call it by its real name. I'm poor. I'm in debt. And I need money more than anyone in this room. But my name isn't for rent." No one in the room stood up. No one called after her. Josie picked up her toolbox, walked out, and made it all the way down that long hallway without looking back once. For the next 4 days, Josie didn't sleep more than 5 hours a night. She still went to work, still tuned 2 pianos at a church over in Medford, still cooked dinner and checked Poppy's homework. And through all 4 of those days, the ivory card remained in the bottom drawer beneath the electric bills, in exactly the same place where she kept the things she didn't want to look at but didn't dare throw away. Early Monday morning, she got up, made coffee, sat down beside the window that looked out on nothing but the lower legs of people passing by, and took the card out. She had already made her decision. She would call them, make it absolutely clear one last time that her answer hadn't changed, tell them not to send anyone looking for her again. Then she would delete the number and her life would return to its old course, cramped and difficult, but hers. She opened the keypad and entered the first 3 digits. Then the phone vibrated in her hand. An unfamiliar number, with the hospital's area code. Josie answered. The caller was a secretary from pediatric cardiology, speaking quickly and very politely, with the voice of someone who had to make 30 calls like this every morning. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Ward. I'm calling about Poppy Ward's follow-up appointment." Josie said, "Yes, the appointment in July, right." The secretary said, "We've moved her appointment up. It'll be next week, Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. Josie sat perfectly still. She watched a strip of sunlight slowly creeping across the kitchen table, and she heard herself ask, "You've moved it up by 2 months." The secretary said yes, and Dr. Novak left a note saying she'd like to speak with the family privately before examining Poppy. "Would you be able to arrive 15 minutes early?" Josie asked if something was wrong. There was a pause on the other end, that very short kind of silence hospital employees seemed trained never to let last too long. Then the secretary said, "The doctor will explain everything to you in detail when you arrive." Josie asked again, asked whether there had been something in the previous results, and the secretary answered in exactly the same polite voice as before, that she was only responsible for scheduling, that she wasn't permitted to discuss medical matters, and that the doctor would explain when Josie came in. Then she wished her a good day and hung up. Josie kept the phone pressed to her ear for a long while after the line had gone silent. In the next room, she could hear Poppy turning over in her sleep. She set the phone down on the table very gently. She looked at the untouched cup of coffee. She looked at the ivory card lying beside it. She sat there for about 40 minutes, without crying, without standing up, simply sitting there, and by the time the strip of sunlight had crossed the entire table, she knew what she was going to do. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, she was on Prince Street. She didn't wait for anyone to lead her anywhere. She walked straight into the study, set her toolbox down on the desk in the middle of the dead man's stack of papers, and said, "I have 3 conditions." Nico Castellani was holding a pen. He set it down. "First," Josie said, "my daughter is 8 years old. As long as she's in that house, no one in that house carries anything dangerous. No one. Nothing. No exceptions. Including you. If I find out it happens even once, I leave that same night. Second, your business doesn't get discussed inside that house. Not at the dinner table. Not in the hallways. Not in the living room. You have an office. Then go to your office and talk about it there. Third, my daughter stays at her old school. She still rides the school bus, still eats lunch in the cafeteria, still goes to her classmates' birthday parties like every other child. I don't want her growing up into someone who gets driven everywhere in a private car and has no friends brave enough to come over and play." When she finished, she stood there with one hand still resting on the handle of her toolbox, waiting for him to negotiate. "He didn't," he said. "Agreed. All 3. Then he called Attorney Baum into the room. The contract was 74 pages long. Josie sat there reading it for nearly 3 hours. Actually reading it, stopping to ask questions in 11 places and insisting that 2 sections be rewritten. Baum explained that it was a prenuptial agreement, dividing property, establishing a monthly allowance, and stating clearly that she relinquished all claims to the family's assets. He added that this kind of document was completely legal in Massachusetts, and that tens of thousands of married couples signed agreements like it every year. As for the $61,000, Baum didn't hand her a check. He handed her an application form. He said the hospital had an assistance fund for patients in financial hardship, that the fund considered income and circumstances, and that her case had qualified for a long time. No one had ever told her to apply. Josie asked where the money in the fund came from. Baum said, "The fund receives donations from many sources, ma'am, and the list of donors is public information. You may look it up any time you wish." He said nothing more, and she didn't ask anything more. As for Poppy, Nico told her only one thing, and he made it very clear that he couldn't buy the little girl's surgery. No one could. That decision belonged to the doctors. What he could buy was time. There was a surgeon at the children's hospital willing to operate the moment Dr. Novak believed it was necessary, with no application, no appeal, no waiting 30 to 45 business days for some committee to sit around a table and decide whether the little girl had become weak enough yet. Josie took Baum's pen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she signed. All 3 places marked with little crosses, exactly as she had 2 years earlier in the 4th-floor hallway. 3 weeks later, someone handed Josie a printed guest list. She read it from top to bottom twice, then asked where my side is. The woman from the law office explained very carefully that the list had been balanced according to relationships between the families, that there were certain people whose presence was required, and certain places that simply couldn't be left empty, and that if Miss Ward had anyone in particular she wanted to invite, she only had to say so and they would consider it. Josie sat there thinking. Both her parents were gone. Elliot had no one left either. Miss Marla was 84 and couldn't climb the church steps. That left the people Josie knew through work, a few school music room administrators, a nun in Medford, and 2 piano technicians in Cambridge, from whom she sometimes borrowed tools. She tried to imagine them sitting inside St. Leonard Church, among men who had come down from New York. Then she said, "Never mind, there isn't anyone." The wedding took place in the very same church where, 50 days earlier, she had stood at the back beside a column and watched 400 people line up to kiss one man's hand. This time, she walked toward the front. They dressed her in an ivory gown she hadn't chosen, brought by someone she'd never met, from a shop she'd never entered. It fit perfectly. Josie stood in the dressing room looking at herself in the mirror and thought that someone must have measured her at some point, without her ever knowing it. The ceremony began at 11 o'clock. The church was full. Not as full as it had been for the funeral, but full enough that there wasn't an empty pew. And Josie walked the entire length of the center aisle, without anyone giving her an arm, because there was no one left to do it. She kept her eyes straight ahead. Nico was waiting at the steps in a dark suit, watching her approach with the expression of a man waiting to sign the final page of a very long file. The priest began to read, and at the exact moment he reached the part where he asked whether she took this man, the church bells began to ring above them. Josie heard it immediately. The second bell was off. Not by much, only about half a tone. The kind of error that 99 people in that church wouldn't have noticed and never would. But to her it rang out as harshly as a plate crashing onto a kitchen floor. For nearly 10 years, she'd made her living with her ear, and that ear had chosen the most solemn moment of her life to remind her who she was, where she was standing, and that some things in this world were out of tune, and no one ever bothered to set them right. She said, "I do." Then came the rings. Nico took her left hand. His thumb touched the scar running along the back of it, the scar she'd spent nearly 10 years training herself to hide, by letting that hand hang at her side, by holding her tools over it, by shaking hands with her right and pulling away quickly. He touched it. He didn't flinch. He didn't look down either, didn't frown, didn't ask a single question. He simply held her hand with exactly enough firmness to slide the ring onto her finger, then let go. Josie looked up at him, and he had already turned his gaze elsewhere. The ceremony ended at 11:40. Outside on the church steps, among people shaking hands and offering congratulations, Nico turned toward her, held out his hand, and said, "Thank you." Josie shook it. The handshake lasted about 2 seconds, exactly as long as the 400 people had given him on the morning of his grandfather's funeral. Then he walked down the steps, got into his car, and his car pulled away before hers did. That afternoon, someone moved the belongings she and Poppy had from Somerville. There wasn't much. 4 cardboard boxes, 1 suitcase, her grandfather's toolbox, and a bag filled with Poppy's stuffed animals. The brownstone stood at the end of Prince Street, 4 stories high, with arched windows, and inside the ceilings were so tall that Josie had to tilt her head back to see the plaster molding. A man in a suit stood at one end of the first-floor hallway. Another moved up and down the stairs. No one spoke loudly. Poppy stood in the middle of the living room holding her grandmother's wooden wind-up metronome, turned slowly in a full circle to take everything in, then walked over to the white marble fireplace and set the metronome on the mantel. She stepped back 2 paces and studied it the way someone studies a picture they've just hung on the wall. Then she tipped her head back toward the ceiling and asked, "Mom, this room is so big. How long do I have to yell before the echo comes back?" Josie hadn't had time to answer before the girl yelled. It was a loud, long yell, the kind made for no reason except to find out how far it would travel, and it traveled beautifully, striking the ceiling, rolling down the hallway, then returning to where mother and daughter stood. Poppy burst into laughter. At the far end of the hallway, the man in the suit turned his head to look in, then turned away again, and Josie saw one of his shoulders move slightly. The girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, yell with me. It isn't loud enough when I do it alone." Josie said no. Poppy said, "Please, just once. I'll count 1, 2, 3. Then she counted, and when she reached 3, Josie shouted with her daughter in the middle of the living room of a house she'd moved into only 40 minutes earlier, and the 2 voices blended together, rose to the ceiling, came tumbling back down, and mother and daughter laughed together. For the first 3 days in the brownstone, Josie ate meals cooked by someone else. A woman named Rosa came down to the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, cooked, served dinner in the first-floor dining room at 7, washed everything afterward, then went home. The food was good. Josie couldn't complain about a single thing. But on the 4th evening, Poppy pushed her plate away and asked, "Mom, when are you going to make mac and cheese?" And Josie realized that for the past 3 days, she had been sitting inside a 4-story house without knowing what to do with her own 2 hands after 6 o'clock in the evening. At 9 o'clock that night, she went down to the kitchen. The kitchen was 4 times the size of their basement apartment in Somerville, with 2 ovens and a steel work table in the middle so long that Poppy could have lain across it sideways, and everything gleamed with the particular kind of cleanliness found in places where someone wiped everything down and then left, rather than places where people actually lived. Josie opened the cabinets. They had everything except what she needed. She had to walk to the grocery store at the end of the street to buy a box of pasta and a bag of shredded cheese. And when she came back carrying the plastic bag through the front door, the man in the suit standing in the hallway looked at the bag, then looked at her with the expression of someone who had just encountered a problem for which no procedure existed. She put water on to boil. Rosa heard the noise, came back, stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and asked, "What do you need me to do?" Josie said, "No, I'll make it myself." Rosa looked at the box of pasta on the steel table, looked at the pot, then said yes, ma'am, and stepped away. But she didn't leave completely. She stayed in the hallway for several more minutes as though waiting to see if something would go wrong. Josie finished cooking close to 10 o'clock. Poppy ate 2 bowls and went to bed. About a third of the pot was left, and Josie had meant to throw it away, but then she didn't. She spooned some onto a plate, covered it, set it on the stove, and turned the burner beneath it to the lowest flame. She didn't really know why she did it. Maybe because her mother used to do the same thing for her father on nights when he came home late from tuning pianos far away. Maybe simply because throwing food away felt wasteful. Close to midnight, she heard the front door open. Josie was sitting at the kitchen table, writing down several things that still needed fixing on the piano at the church in Medford. Footsteps moved through the hallway, then stopped. She looked up. Nico Castellani was standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his overcoat, keys in one hand. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the stove, at the covered plate, with the tiny blue flame burning beneath it. He stood there much longer than it should have taken to recognize that it was a plate of food. Josie said, "I made too much." He said, "Yes." Then he said, "Thank you," and turned away, and she heard his footsteps climbing the stairs, past the 2nd floor, up to the 3rd, then heard a door close. Josie remained seated for a little while longer. Then she turned off the flame, left the plate where it was, and went to bed. The next morning, she came down to the kitchen at 7 o'clock. The plate was no longer on the stove. It had been washed clean and placed upside down in the rack beside the sink, along with a fork. Rosa hadn't arrived yet. There was no one else in the kitchen. Josie stood looking at that plate in the rack for quite a long time, and she never mentioned it to anyone. Not that day, and not on any day afterward. On the 6th day in the house, Poppy met him for the first time. The girl was sitting at the 1st floor dining table doing her homework when he walked past, and she looked up and greeted him in the polite voice her mother had taught her to use. He stopped. He said hello. Poppy immediately asked, "Do you know how to read music?" Josie was standing in the kitchen doorway behind them. She saw him go silent for about 1 second, and that was a very long second for a man she had once watched sit without blinking, while another person spoke for 10 straight minutes. Then he said, "No, I don't." Poppy nodded with an expression of sympathy. She said, "That's okay, because there's a boy named Denny in my class who doesn't know either, and he's been learning forever, but he still mixes up the lines and the spaces." Then the girl flipped over the sheet of paper on the table. It was a menu from the restaurant on Hanover Street, though no one seemed to know how it had ended up in her pile of scrap paper. Poppy took her pencil and drew 5 horizontal lines, carefully, her hand wobbling a little on the 4th one. Then she said, "This is a staff. It has 5 lines and 4 spaces. Do you remember?" Nico stood there. He didn't sit down, but he didn't walk away either. Poppy drew a little circle on the 1st line from the bottom and said, "This is E." Then she drew another little circle in the 1st space and said, "This is F." Then she looked up at him and asked, "Now you say them back to me?" In the kitchen behind them, Josie stood perfectly still, the dish towel still in her hand. She heard that man's voice, slow and low as always, say, "E, F," and she heard her daughter clap once and announce that he was already learning much faster than Denny, and tomorrow she'd teach him more. The Steinway followed Josie and Poppy to the brownstone along with their boxes, and no one explained why. They moved it from the old house on Prince Street, placed it in the 1st floor living room against the eastern wall, covered it again with the cloth, and left. It stood there for 4 days. On the 5th day, Josie pulled the cover off. She had tuned it, yes, but tuning was only half the work. She opened the top lid, removed the music desk, and began finishing the part she had been paid to do, but had never been given the chance to complete. She replaced the entire bass string set, the copper wound strings that had darkened after lying untouched for 22 years. She regulated the whole line of hammers, used a 3-needle voicing tool to work into the hardened felt until it softened again, then reshaped each hammerhead into a smooth curve, one at a time, all 88 of them. It took her 6 afternoons. She worked without asking anyone, without requesting anyone's permission, and during those 6 afternoons, no one in that 4-story house asked what she was doing. On the 7th afternoon, she opened the arched window. April air from Prince Street came flowing in, carrying car horns and voices from outside, and for the first time the room didn't sound like a sealed box. Then she called Poppy downstairs. The girl had only been taking piano lessons for 5 months through the school's free music program, knew exactly 3 pieces, and her favorite was Fur-Elise. She played it the way an 8-year-old played, which meant the first 4 measures came out smooth and easy. The 5th slowed down. The transition stopped completely while she searched for the next note. and then she started moving again. She made the same mistake in the same place 3 times in a row, and burst out laughing all 3 times. Josie sat beside her and corrected her fingering. The next afternoon, the girl played again. The afternoon after that, she played again. By the 4th afternoon, it had become a routine. Around 5 o'clock, when the sunlight slanted through the arched windows, there would be piano music inside that house. Rosa began humming along from the kitchen. The man in the suit at the end of the hallway stopped turning his head toward the room, but he didn't move somewhere else either. On the 5th afternoon, Nico Castellani came home earlier than usual. Josie didn't hear the front door because Poppy was playing through the middle section. She only knew something had changed when the girl stopped. Josie looked up. He was standing at the foot of the staircase, one hand still resting on the wooden newel post, and he wasn't moving. He wasn't looking at the child. He was looking at the piano. Josie had seen people freeze in her life, but she had never seen anyone stand quite like that. His entire body remained straight, his suit still buttoned, his hand still resting on the post, and nothing about him moved, not even his eyes. It lasted for 5 or 6 seconds. Then he said, his voice still low and slow as always, though something inside it had tightened, "Who gave you permission to open that piano?" Poppy slipped down from the bench. Josie stood, walked around in front of her daughter, and told her to go upstairs and bring down her music notebook. Her voice normal, unhurried. The girl ran upstairs. Josie waited until the sound of her small footsteps faded on the staircase before turning back. She said, "I opened it. I tuned it. I replaced its strings. I regulated all 88 of its hammers. And I opened it," he said. "You didn't have the right." Josie said, "I know." Then she continued, no louder than he had spoken. "You paid me to make that piano sound again. You paid me yourself, months ago, in that other house. Now it can make sound again, and you're telling me I had no right. So what do you want? Do you want it lying silent under a cloth for another 22 years? He didn't answer. Josie said, "A piano that isn't played isn't a memory, Mr. Castellani. It's a coffin with 3 legs. You put it in the middle of the living room and walk past it twice a day." He didn't shout. She had prepared herself for him to shout, or worse, to use the same voice she'd heard him use with the man in the Hanover Street restaurant. He did neither. He took his hand off the newel post, sat down on the 3rd stair, rested both elbows on his knees, and lowered his head. The only sound left in the room was the noise from the street drifting in through the open arched window. Josie stood still. She thought she should leave. Then she didn't. She sat down on the piano bench with her back to the keys and waited. It was a long time before he finally spoke. "My mother's name was Anna. She was my grandfather's daughter-in-law." Josie didn't ask anything. He continued, briefly, evenly, in the voice of someone describing something he had packed away a long time ago and had never intended to open again. "My father went to prison when I was 4, 11 years. For all 11 of those years, my mother stayed in this house, downstairs, and she taught piano. Her students were children from the neighborhood, $2 a lesson. If a child couldn't pay, she taught them anyway. There were afternoons when this house was always full of piano music, one child playing something wrong, then another trying it again. My grandfather hated it. He said it was noisy, but he never stopped her." He paused. Then he said, "When I was 12, she became ill. She kept playing until she couldn't lift her hands to the keyboard anymore. The last time she played, she made it halfway through a piece and stopped, and she said, 'Sweetheart, close the lid for me.' I closed it. 3 weeks later, she died." Josie asked very quietly, "And since that day," he said, "no one has opened it, not even me." Then he stood, brushed off his sleeves, and said one final thing before walking upstairs, without turning back to look at her. "The girl makes a mistake in the 9th measure. Her left hand is supposed to release half a beat earlier. It began with something very small. Near the end of April, the church in Medford called to ask whether she was free before Easter, and Josie wanted to check when she'd last worked on their piano so she could figure out whether the strings needed replacing or whether another tuning would be enough. She opened the contacts on her phone, searched for the Medford church, and saw that name beneath a number she had saved a long time ago with the note referral source. She tapped the number to see when it had called her, and she discovered that it wasn't listed only under the Medford church. Josie sat down on the piano bench in the 1st floor living room. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night, and she began working backward through her contacts from the bottom up. Charlestown Elementary School, 2 years earlier. The referral had come from that number. The house in Beacon Hill with the Bosendorfer she'd serviced 3 times in 4 years. The first call had come from that number. The church hall in Medford, the high school music room in Everett, the pawn shop on Salem Street, with an upright the owner wanted to sell, 2 small recording studios in Cambridge, the nursing home in Malden that called her twice every year. She counted 19 jobs. 19 sources of work spread across 6 years, which meant almost everything that had kept her and her daughter alive since her father died and the piano shop burned to the ground. All 19 had begun with the same phone number. Josie sat motionless for a very long time. For those 6 years, she had believed one thing, and she had built her life around believing it. She believed she'd lost everything and then gotten herself back on her feet, that she'd tuned one piano at a time, done careful work, and people had passed her name from one person to another, and somehow she'd managed to support her child that way. She had been proud of that, in the quiet way people are proud of things they never say aloud to anyone. Now she sat in a living room with a high ceiling, staring at the screen of her phone, and understood that for all 6 of those years, someone had been standing behind her, pushing one job after another into her path, enough to keep her alive but never enough for her to notice. The next morning, she waited in the backyard. Gus Prisco was in his 50s, short and broad, and had been driving for the family so long that no one remembered what year he'd started. He was cleaning the car windows. Josie held out her phone with the number already open on the screen and asked, "Do you recognize this number?" Gus looked at the screen. He didn't pretend to be surprised, didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't reach out to take the phone. He simply stopped wiping the glass, straightened, and said, "Yes, that's mine." Josie asked, "You've called me 19 times over the past 6 years. You referred me to 19 places. Why?" Gus Prisco looked down at the cloth in his hand. Then he said, "I was following orders, ma'am." Josie asked, "Whose orders?" He didn't answer. She asked again, more slowly this time. Gus Prisco looked up at her, and there was nothing evasive in his eyes, only the expression of a man who had spent his entire life in a profession where refusing to answer could sometimes be a form of kindness. He said, "Ma'am, I drive the car." Then he bent down and went back to cleaning the window. Josie stood there a little longer before going back inside. She didn't ask anyone else. She didn't tell anyone either. But something inside her shifted places that morning, and the following week it turned into something she herself couldn't explain why she was doing. That Sunday, she started cooking at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She told Rosa to sit down, and when Rosa said, "I can't, ma'am," Josie pulled out a chair and said, "I'm cooking, so I'm inviting you. Sit." She went out to the backyard and called Gus inside. She went to the first-floor hallway and called over the 2 men in suits who had been standing guard since morning, one named Mattia, the other Bruno, and it took several minutes before the 2 of them understood that she was inviting them to dinner rather than ordering them to set the table. At 7 o'clock that evening, 6 people were seated around the first-floor dining table, and with Poppy, that made 7. No one knew what to say for the first 10 minutes. Rosa sat with her back perfectly straight as though she were in church. Bruno held his fork but didn't dare take the first bite. Then Poppy asked Uncle Mattia whether he knew how to swim, and Mattia said yes, and the girl asked how many laps of a pool he could swim, and Mattia thought about it for a moment before saying 4, and Gus Prisco snorted and said 4 is about what my dog can do, and the whole table laughed. After that, everything began to flow. Nico Castellani came home at 7:20. He stopped in the dining room doorway. He looked at the table in his own house, where the driver was arguing with the doorman about swimming, where the cook was sitting down eating food someone else had prepared, where an 8-year-old girl sat at the head of the table holding the soup ladle and serving everyone because she'd appointed herself to the job. 6 people were sitting down together in a house where, before that night, there had never been more than 2 people at the same table. Josie looked up at him. She didn't say anything. She simply pushed the empty chair at the far end of the table out with the toe of her shoe. Nico stood there for about 3 seconds. Then he took off his overcoat, draped it over the back of the chair, and sat down. Josie was given 3 days' notice. On Saturday evening, 5 men would be coming to dinner, and one of those 5 was Cosimo Amato, whom Josie had seen only once before, at the funeral, when the entire church rose to its feet for an old man with a cane who had to be helped inside by 3 people. Nico said exactly 2 things to her about that evening. The first was that they were coming to look. The second was that she didn't need to perform for anyone. She should simply be herself. Josie sent Poppy to stay with a classmate beginning Friday afternoon, at the house in Charlestown, with the calico cat the girl had been asking to visit for 3 weeks. Josie cooked herself. Rosa helped, but Josie did the cooking, and she made 4 ordinary dishes, the kind normal people ate at home rather than restaurant food, because she thought that if these men were coming to look, then they might as well see exactly what was there. At 7 o'clock that evening, 5 men sat down around the first-floor dining table. Cosimo Amato was 81 years old, seated at the end opposite Nico, eating very slowly and speaking very little. Josie couldn't remember all the names of the other 3 men. The 5th man, seated to Cosimo's right, was the silver-haired man she'd seen at the church, the one who had held Nico's hand for 1 extra beat, Salvatore Renzi. He talked more than anyone else at the table. He complimented the food, complimented the house, asked Josie what she did for a living, and when she said she tuned pianos, he nodded appreciatively and said how lovely, such a refined profession, it must be very peaceful. She said yes, very peaceful. They were well into the main course when Renzi set down his fork, wiped his mouth with his napkin, then bent beside his chair and took out a thin leather briefcase. He opened it and placed a thick stack of photocopied papers on the table, stapled at one corner. He pushed it toward the opposite end of the table. Everyone went silent. Renzi spoke in the same gentle voice he'd used when complimenting the food. "Gentlemen, I'm very sorry to do this at the dinner table, but Aurelio was my friend for 40 years, and I believe he would want you to know." Cosimo Amato didn't pick it up immediately. The old man took his reading glasses from his jacket pocket, put them on, then pulled the papers closer. He turned the pages. He kept turning for a very long time, 1 page at a time, skipping none of them, and no one at the table said a word throughout. Josie remained still. She could see a faint mark from Baum's law office in the upper right corner of every page. Nico didn't move. He sat straight-backed with his hands resting lightly on the table, exactly as Josie had seen him through the cracked kitchen door at the Hanover Street restaurant, and she understood that he was doing the same thing he'd done that day, letting the other man say everything he had come to say. Cosimo reached the last page. He removed his glasses, folded them, and looked up at Josie. He asked exactly 1 question. "Did you sign this?" Josie set down her napkin. She said yes. Renzi leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders loosened. Josie stood. She didn't go anywhere. She simply stood there with both hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, and before anyone else could speak, she continued, "I signed a property agreement, Mr. Amato. It's 74 pages long. It says how much allowance I receive each month. It says I have no rights to any of this family's property. It says that if we divorce, I leave with exactly what I brought in. I read every page in 3 hours. I asked questions in 11 places, and I made them revise 2 sections. Mr. Renzi, what you just showed everyone at this table is a prenuptial agreement. Tens of thousands of people sign those in this state every year. Your daughter probably signed one when she married." Then she looked directly at Renzi. "Do you have a piece of paper saying I'm being paid to pretend to love my husband?" 1 line. Just 1 line saying this marriage was staged. Saying I was hired. Saying there's an expiration date. Go ahead and show it. Renzi opened his mouth. Josie continued before he could interrupt. "You don't have one, because that paper doesn't exist. You've had 74 pages in your hands for weeks. You've read them over and over, searched through them again and again, and the only thing you found was a document any attorney in Boston could draft in an afternoon." The dining room was so quiet that the clock in the hallway could be heard ticking. Cosimo Amato sat perfectly still. Then the old man placed 1 hand on the stack of papers, pulled it closer, and spoke in the dry voice of an 81-year-old man. "Salvatore," Renzi said. "Yes, sir." Cosimo asked, "Where did you get this?" Renzi said nothing. Cosimo turned back to the first page, pointed to the faint mark in the upper right corner, and continued, "This is the mark of Howard Baum's office. The original is in Baum's safe. There are 3 copies. 1 in the safe, 1 with the attorney administering the trust, and 1 with the court. You aren't any of those 3 parties." The old man looked up. "So who in this family's law office are you paying?" Renzi said, "Sir, that's not as important as—" Cosimo cut him off. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "It's the only thing that matters." Then he folded the stack of papers in half and slid it across the tabletop toward Renzi. "You've spent 3 weeks reading 74 pages looking for evidence against the boy. You didn't find any, but you just brought me evidence against yourself all the way to this dinner table, Salvatore." Renzi didn't pick up the papers. They remained there in front of him, folded in half, until the meal ended. And throughout the rest of that evening, Josie noticed that Cosimo Amato didn't ask her another question. But every time she stood to bring more food to the table, the old man watched her. The last guest left the house close to 11 o'clock. Josie stood at the kitchen sink with her hands submerged in warm water, washing the dishes one by one, even though she knew Rosa would come the next morning and do it herself. She washed because she needed something to do with her hands. She had sat with her back straight for 3 full hours that evening, and now that no one was watching anymore, her shoulders finally began to tremble. Nico came into the kitchen as she was placing the last plate on the rack. He said nothing about Renzi. He said nothing about Cosimo Amato. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment and then asked, "Would you play something for me?" Josie turned off the faucet. She said, "I can't play," he said. "I've seen you sitting on that bench dozens of times." Josie dried her hands with a towel, then turned around and raised her left hand in front of him, palm facing upward beneath the kitchen light. She let him look carefully. The scar ran along the back of her hand from the wrist joint almost to the knuckles, faded pale after 9 years, and her last 2 fingers curved inward at a slight angle, the kind of angle that someone looking casually might mistake for a relaxed hand. She tried to straighten them. They wouldn't straighten. She said, "When I was 20, I was in my final year at the conservatory, full scholarship. That October, I was driving on Starro when a car cut across from the inside lane. I woke up in the hospital with my left arm in a cast all the way to the elbow. They repaired the tendons twice. I did physical therapy for 7 months, twice a day, every day. And in the 7th month, the doctor told me I would be able to hold a glass of water, hold a pen, do almost everything a person needs to do in life. Except one thing." She lowered her hand. "I haven't been able to play since then. I only tune pianos so other people can play them." Nico kept looking at that hand for a moment, even after she had lowered it. Then he didn't say any of the things she had prepared herself to hear. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "You're remarkable." He didn't say anything like that. He turned and walked into the living room. Josie followed him without understanding why she was following. He went to the Steinway, pulled out the bench, and sat down. But he didn't sit in the middle. He shifted all the way to the left, leaving half the bench empty on the right, and placed both hands over the lower keys. Then he said, "Then you play the right hand." It was the first time he had spoken to her with that kind of intimacy. Josie stood there for quite a while. Then she sat down on the other half of the bench. He named one of Chopin's nocturnes, the one in E-flat major, the piece anyone who had ever studied piano knew. He asked, "You know this one, don't you?" Josie said, "I do," he said. "I only remember the left hand." Then he began. He played very slowly, far slower than the piece was meant to be played, so slowly that it took Josie 4 measures to realize he was playing the correct piece. His fingers were large and stiff, and he pressed the keys the way someone did who had learned piano at 7 years old and then stopped completely, which meant the fingers remembered where to go but no longer remembered how much weight to use. He made a mistake in the 3rd measure. He stopped, went back to the beginning of the measure, played it again, and this time got it right. Josie raised her right hand over the upper keys. She waited through 1 more measure, then she entered. She hadn't played in 9 years. Her right hand was still intact, but the reflexes had gone dull, and her first few notes sounded rigid, like those of a beginner. By the 8th measure, they began to soften. When they reached the long sustained passage in the middle, she closed her eyes. The 2 of them played the entire piece in nearly 7 minutes, almost twice as long as it normally took, and between them they made about 11 mistakes, and twice the left hand moved half a beat ahead of the right, and had to wait for it to catch up. No one in the world could have called what they had just played beautiful, but it was a complete piece of music, from the first note to the last, played by 4 hands of which only 2 were fully uninjured, in a room where that piano had remained silent for 22 years. When the final note had completely faded, neither of them turned to look at the other. They sat quietly on the same bench, staring straight ahead at the keys, and they stayed that way until the clock in the hallway struck 12. Then Josie stood and said, "Good night." That night, she lay awake for a long time, not because of Renzi, not because of the stack of papers folded in half on the dining table, but because she realized that during those 7 minutes, she hadn't thought about the contract even once, and that frightened her more than anything that had happened since March. The next morning, she came downstairs at 7 o'clock. He was sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee. Josie pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, and said it immediately, without circling around it, because she knew that if she tried to work her way toward it, she wouldn't be able to say it at all. She said, "I want to cancel the agreement." He set down his cup. She continued, "I'll pay the debt back gradually. I'll figure out how much I can pay every month. If it takes 10 years, then it takes 10 years. I'll sign whatever papers are necessary. As for my daughter's surgery, I'm asking you to keep your word, and I'll owe you for that for the rest of my life. But for everything else, you should find someone else, and you should do it soon. 9 months is more than enough time." He asked why. Josie sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I signed away 2 years to pay a debt, Mr. Castellani. I didn't sign up to hurt myself." Nico didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his coffee, and he remained silent for so long that Josie was about to stand. Then he said, "I won't find someone else." Josie asked why. He didn't answer. He simply lifted his coffee and drank. And by the end of that morning, she understood that he would never answer that question. Salvatore Renzi no longer had time to wait. That contingency clause benefited him in exactly one situation. If the court declared that the marriage had been arranged for the purpose of gaining control of the trust, and issued that ruling before the 12 months were over, after that point, everything would transfer without conditions, and nothing he did would matter anymore. So during the first week of May, Howard Baum's law office received a large envelope with no return address. Inside were records comparing the donation history of the Patient Assistance Fund at the Children's Hospital, a timeline covering the previous 3 months, and a typed page identifying 3 dates that the writer believed matched up in a suspicious way. Baum called Nico on Thursday afternoon. Josie knew nothing about it. All she knew was that he didn't come home for dinner Thursday night, and late that night she heard more cars than usual coming and going through the backyard. On Friday afternoon, Poppy went to Somerville to spend the night at Miss Marla's house. The girl had started asking 4 days earlier, asking the way children did, once every day until the grown-ups finally agreed, because Miss Marla's old cat had just given birth to 4 kittens and had promised to save one for Poppy to name. Josie took her over at 5 o'clock, stayed for half an hour drinking tea with the old woman, listened as Poppy named the yellow kitten Bread, then left. At 10:40 that night, her phone vibrated. It was someone she knew at the parking lot on Beacon Street, where she'd kept the van ever since moving to Prince Street because the brownstone had no space for it. The person said, "You need to come right away. Your van burned." Josie arrived at 11:15. The fire trucks were already gone. Her father's van sat in the corner of the lot, and it wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was a black metal frame. All 4 tires melted down into the asphalt. Every window shattered. The inside burned hollow. The van was 33 years old. Her father had bought it in 1993 and painted Ward and daughter by hand along both sides, and the word daughter had been added when Josie was 11 because she'd insisted on it. The security guard told her no one had been hurt. The fire hadn't spread to any other cars, probably just an electrical short. "Ma'am, the vehicle was very old." Josie stood, looking at the blackened frame for about 10 minutes. She didn't cry. She only stood there thinking how lucky it was that Poppy was in Somerville, asleep in a room with 4 kittens, and wouldn't have to see this. She got home close to 1 o'clock in the morning. Nico came in about 40 minutes after she did. He entered through the back door. Josie was sitting at the kitchen table with the main lights off, only the small lamp above the counter burning. He stopped when he saw her. There was a dark stain on the right cuff of his shirt, already dry, and it wasn't in a place where someone would normally injure himself. He didn't hide it. He didn't explain it either. He only said, "That won't happen again." Josie stood up. She said, "Tonight I stood in that parking lot for half an hour, and through that entire half hour there was only one thing I could think about. My daughter was somewhere else. Do you know what kind of person thinks like that? That's how someone thinks when she lives in your house." She continued, without raising her voice, "I know what you're using me for. I sit at the head of the table so 5 old men can look at me. I cook dinner, I argue with Renzi, and every time I do, you look a little cleaner in their eyes. I'm a coat of paint. You brush me over this house and tell everyone to look at how new it seems. But underneath the paint, the wood is still the same." Nico stood there for a very long time. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. And he told her something he had never told anyone in that house, and would never say a second time. He said, "Last year I sold off 2/3 of the operations at the South Harbor. This year I'm converting the entire transportation side into civilian contracts, with invoices, taxes, audits. It took me 14 months to get that far, and I have at least 3 more years ahead of me." Josie asked, "Then why don't you do it faster?" He said, "Because 300 people make their living from this, not 300 men carrying guns. There's a 70-year-old man watching a warehouse. There are women washing dishes in restaurants. There are 11 families in this neighborhood whose children's tuition comes out of that money. If I cut it off too quickly, they go hungry, and the people above me don't need a reason. They only need to see me look weak. If I dismantle it too fast, I'll be dead before I finish, and the person who takes my place will be Renzi, and he won't dismantle anything." He stopped. Then he said, "I need 12 months, and I need a reason to believe there's something on the other side of those 12 months worth reaching." Josie stood there with one hand resting on the back of the chair. She thought about the black metal frame in the corner of the parking lot. She thought about the word daughter her father had painted by hand. She thought about the little girl sleeping in Somerville, and about the Wednesday hospital appointment drawing closer. She didn't say "I understand." She didn't say "I forgive you." She didn't say any of those things. Not that night, or on any day afterward. She simply sat back down in the chair she'd just risen from, and said, "Go change your shirt. I'll make coffee." The surgery fell on a Tuesday in early June, 8 weeks after the night at the parking lot. Dr. Novak had met privately with Josie 3 times during those 8 weeks, explaining everything, drawing diagrams on paper, and every time she ended with the same words, "Just let us take care of it." That morning, mother and daughter were awake by 5 o'clock. Poppy wasn't allowed to eat breakfast, so she was irritable, and she made up for it by talking nonstop the entire way there. When they reached the hallway outside the preparation room, and someone told her that Mom had to wait outside, the girl turned back, tugged on her mother's sleeve, and asked a question she must have been thinking about for some time. "Mom, when this is over, can I learn to play a real piano?" Josie asked what she meant by a real piano. Poppy said, "The big kind, like the one we have at home, not the electric piano at school, because the G key on that one buzzes." Josie said yes. The girl nodded, apparently satisfied that the matter had been settled, then followed the nurse inside. The waiting room on the 4th floor had 12 blue plastic chairs and a clock hanging on the wall above the vending machine. Josie sat in the 3rd chair from the window. Nico sat 1 chair away from her. He arrived at 7:15, said nothing, simply sat down, and stayed there the entire time. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. People came in and left. Another family had their name called and went away, and the nursing staff changed shifts 3 times. He didn't open his phone once. He didn't get up to pace. He didn't eat. By the middle of the afternoon, Josie told him to go down to the cafeteria and get something to eat. And he said, "I'm not hungry." And those were the only 4 words he spoke from 7:15 in the morning until 7 o'clock that evening. Josie counted. She counted the ceiling tiles, counted the sweeps of the second hand, and at one point she realized she was tapping her fingers against her thigh to the exact rhythm of the nocturne they had played together, twice as slowly as it should have been, and she had to make herself stop. At 9:20 that night, Dr. Novak pushed open the door and stepped out. She removed her mask before she spoke, and after 2 years of hospitals with Elliot, Josie had learned that doctors only took off their masks before speaking when they believed the news was good. She said everything had gone as expected. Poppy was doing well, and if nothing unusual happened over the next 3 days, then it could be considered done. Josie dropped back into the plastic chair. She heard herself saying thank you 4 or 5 times. Then she turned to the side. Nico Castellani was still sitting upright in exactly the same position, still saying nothing, and both hands resting on his knees were trembling. Not badly, just a faint tremor at the fingertips, the kind no one would have noticed unless they were sitting only 1 chair away. He realized she was looking at him. He closed both hands into fists, stood, and walked out into the hallway. Poppy woke the next morning, and the first thing she did was demand ice cream, and when the nurse told her they would see a little later, she added that she wanted the kind with 2 cuts because she could eat the 1-color kind too, but 2 colors was better. The next 3 months were quiet. The 4-story brownstone began to fill with sound. Poppy's drawings covered 1 refrigerator door, then spilled onto the second. Rosa taught her how to make almond cookies, and the 2 of them burned an entire batch. Gus Prisco fixed the chain on her bicycle. By August, Josie had started a free piano class in the hall at St. Leonard Church on Saturday afternoons. And there were 4 children at the first lesson, then 11 by the 4th, and she had to ask for another bench. She taught with her right hand and used her left hand to point. Not one child asked why she didn't play with both hands, because children accepted things exactly as they were. One afternoon near the end of August, Poppy was coloring at the dining table when she looked up and asked, "Mom, did Grandpa have nice handwriting?" Josie asked why she wanted to know. The girl said her teacher had told them that bad handwriting came from being lazy, but Mom always said Grandpa worked very hard. Josie said he wrote in a slant, a little small, but you could read every word. Then she stood there with a dish towel in her hand and realized it had been 6 years since she'd seen her father's handwriting. On the 3rd floor, inside the built-in wardrobe in the bedroom, there was a wooden box that had been moved from Somerville with the 4 cardboard boxes back in April. It was her father's old toolbox, the same box Poppy had used as a desk for 2 years in the basement apartment. Josie hadn't opened it once since his funeral. She carried it downstairs. Inside were the things she'd expected to find. Several tuning levers in different sizes, a box of felt, a coil of rusted steel wire, a rubber wedge, and at the very bottom, lying flat against the wood, was a brown leather notebook. Josie knew that notebook. Her father had written in it for 30 years. Every time he came home from a job, 1 line for each piano, the date, the owner's name, the address, the manufacturer, the year it was made, and what work he'd done. He used to say that in this trade, someone might call again 10 years later, and you had to know what you'd done the last time. Josie turned the pages. The handwriting slanted and ran a little small, exactly as she'd told her daughter. She skimmed through the years when she was still a child and saw her own name appear in several entries from 1999, with notes saying Josie came along, practiced removing strings. She kept turning toward the end, and the final 3 pages were completely different. They weren't technical records anymore. The handwriting was much more hurried, sharply slanted, with places where the pen had pressed so hard it tore the paper, phrases underlined twice, and one number written and rewritten 3 times in the margin. Josie lowered herself onto the floor. She turned to the last line her father had ever written in his life. It was dated November 17th, the day before the piano shop burned, and the address written beside it was the Renzi house. Josie sat on the living room floor until nearly midnight, with the notebook open across her lap. She read the final 3 pages 7 or 8 times. Her father had written in fragments, not full sentences, the kind of notes a person wrote for himself rather than for anyone else to read. There was the word staircase. There were the words underneath, underlined twice. There was a 7-digit number written and rewritten 3 times in the margin, each time in a different size, as though he had kept repeating it to himself to make sure he had it right. One line said, "Ask Gino again." Another said, "Tell no one until certain." And there was one line pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through it. Only 2 words. "He knows." Josie didn't know who Gino was. She didn't know what the 7-digit number meant. But she knew one thing she had never questioned in 6 years, that on November 18th of that year, someone had called her at 4 o'clock in the morning and told her the piano shop had burned. And in the Boston Fire Department report there was a line stating that the cause had been an electrical short in the old wiring. And she had believed that line for 6 years because she'd had no reason not to believe it. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she stood up. She went to the 3rd floor, walked the length of the hallway, and stopped at the double doors of the study she hadn't entered once since moving into the house. A man in a suit approached as though he was about to say something, and she looked at him, and he stepped back. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had that morning in March, when she'd sat there and listened to someone read her name from the will. The stack of papers, the folded reading glasses, the wooden smoking pipe. Josie searched through the old documents. She wanted anything from that year, any name at all. She lifted the stack of files from the top, and beneath them, lying on the desk, was a U-shaped piece of steel with a short handle. Josie went still. The tuning fork was 5 inches long, sounded an A at 440 Hz, made by Whitner, and at the point where the 2 prongs met, there was a small nick from when her father had dropped it onto the concrete floor when she was 14. He'd had 2 of them. He gave the first one to her when she entered the conservatory, and it was downstairs in her toolbox. He kept the second one, and it had been inside the shop on the night of the fire, and in the insurance company's inventory of destroyed property afterward, it was listed on line 29. She picked it up. She tapped it lightly against the edge of the desk. It rang a perfect A, pure and straight, without the slightest deviation. Josie sat down in the dead man's chair and stayed there for a very long time, the tuning fork clenched in her hand, while one thing after another from the past 6 years arranged itself into a line before her eyes. 19 jobs that had come through Gus Prisco's phone number, the nursing home in Malden that called her twice every year, the name Josephine Marie Ward, typed in full with her middle name, buried between clauses about harbor rights, the thing the old man had told her in the living room that afternoon, that everyone was missing something, and wisdom was finding the person who lacked exactly what you had too much of, the name Dr. Ellen Novak, which he had spoken when she hadn't told anyone in that house. It hadn't been kindness. It had been a man who knew exactly what had happened to her father, knew who had done it, and chose not to say anything, because saying it would mean having to deal with a man who had sat at his table for 40 years, and because in his world, keeping peace within the family had been worth more than justice for a piano tuner. So instead of telling her, he paid in installments. He paid with jobs, paid with a name written into a will, paid over 6 years, and kept this object on his desk like a bill he had never finished settling. Josie came downstairs at 7 o'clock. She packed her things, not much, exactly what she'd brought with her in April. She placed the notebook and the tuning fork on the living room table. Nico came downstairs at 7:20. He looked first at the bag at the foot of the stairs, then at the things on the table, and stopped in the middle of the room. Josie said, "Your grandfather knew who burned my father's shop. He kept this on his desk for 6 years. He gave me work. He wrote my name into his will, And for all 6 of those years, he still sat down and ate with the man who did it. I sleep in this house. I let my daughter grow up here. Now you tell me how I'm supposed to live with that. Nico said nothing. He walked past her to the writing desk in the corner of the living room, opened the second drawer, and took out a thick file tied with string. He placed it on the table beside the notebook. Josie opened it. Inside was a copy of the scene examination report, signed by a fire investigator who had retired in 2012. There were 3 pages analyzing the point of origin, concluding that the fire hadn't started at the breaker box. There was a typed statement from a man named Gino Marchetti, dated June of this year, admitting that 6 years earlier, he had been paid to tell the fire department that he had seen the lights inside the shop flickering that night. Datmer 4 pages of account statements, 3 numbers circled in pencil, and the number on the second line matched exactly the 7-digit number her father had written and rewritten 3 times in the margin of the final page of his notebook. Josie looked up. She asked, "When did you start?" Nico said, "The 3rd month. I got the fire records in June of last year, before my grandfather died. I'd suspected it for a long time, but suspicion isn't something you can use." Josie said, "Then why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because until last week, I was still missing one thing. Marchetti's statement doesn't name anyone. He only says the man who gave him the money was middle-aged. The bank records prove where the money came from and where it went, but they don't prove what it was for. If I take it before the council now, Renzi denies everything in 3 minutes, and I lose the chance for good." Then he continued, more slowly, "And because I knew that the day you held it in your hands, you'd leave. So every time I meant to tell you, I asked myself for 1 more month. I've done that 6 times. He looked at the bag at the foot of the stairs. "Now I'm asking for 3 days. Josie stayed for those 3 days. She didn't tell him she forgave him, because she didn't. And she didn't tell him she was leaving either, because she still didn't know. She simply stayed, and every night she sat with her father's notebook, comparing each line on those final 3 pages with every page in the file tied with string. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found the thing that both Nico and his 2 attorneys had overlooked for 2 full months, because they had read the notebook like a diary, while she read it the way a tradesman's daughter read a work ledger. On the second-to-last page, buried among the hurried notes, her father had still kept the habit he'd followed for 30 years, recording the work he had done. November 11th, Renzi Residence, Marlborough Street, 1968, Baldwin, tuning and voicing, 11th visit. And beneath that line, he had added 4 words, heard from underneath. The council met Saturday morning in a private room at the Hanover Street restaurant, the same room Josie had looked into through the crack in the kitchen door months earlier. There were 5 old men and Nico. No one carried anything dangerous. Josie placed the leather notebook on the table and pushed it toward Cosimo Amato. 30 years of handwriting, slanted and slightly small, written in 3 different kinds of ink, pages yellowed unevenly with age. The spine naturally split at the places most often opened. No one could forge something like that, and everyone sitting in that room knew it. Nico placed the file beside it. Cosimo put on his glasses and read. He read for nearly 40 minutes, and no one said a single word. He read Gino Marchetti's statement, the fire investigation report, the 4 pages of account records, then returned to the notebook and compared the 7-digit number in the margin of the final page with the number circled in pencil on the second line. Then he removed his glasses. Salvatore Renzi sat at the far end of the table. He said the whole thing was absurd, that some piano tuner scribbling nonsense in a notebook proved nothing, that he had served this family for 40 years. Cosimo Amato didn't argue with him. The old man asked only one question. "On November 11th of that year, did anyone come to your house to discuss business?" Renzi was silent. He stayed silent a little too long, and that silence answered for him in front of 5 men. Cosimo passed judgment right there at the table, in the dry voice of an 81-year-old man, and Nico Castellani didn't say a single word from beginning to end. He didn't stand. He didn't make any request. He kept his hands clean exactly as he had promised her that night at the kitchen table. When Renzi was escorted from the room, he passed the place where Josie was sitting, and she stood. She said, "My father came to your house 11 times. 11 times you let a man sit underneath your piano for 4 hours at a time, without ever bothering to remember his face. You thought he was furniture. Furniture has ears, Mr. Renzi, and furniture keeps records." That afternoon, the 2 of them went home, and neither said anything during the entire ride. In the living room, Nico walked to the Steinway and placed a ring of keys and a stack of papers on the lid. He said, "The property on Salem Street, where the old shop stood, I bought it back in February. Construction was finished last week." Josie opened the papers. On the first page, on the line marked owner, there was only one name, and that name was hers, alone, with no other name beside it. Nico said, "I'm not buying you. I'm only giving back what my family took from you. This belongs to you no matter what you choose, and you don't have to come back." Josie stood there with the keys in her hand. Until that moment, her entire life had been decided by someone else. A car cutting across from the inside lane had decided she would never play piano again. A sheet of paper in a fourth-floor hallway had decided she would owe $61,000. A typed name in a dead man's will had decided she would get married. And now, for the first time in her life, no one was deciding anything for her. There was no clause, no debt between anyone, only a ring of keys in her palm, and two paths opening before her with equal freedom. She set the keys down on the piano lid. Then she said, "I'm staying." Footsteps came running from the hallway, and Poppy burst into the living room clutching the wooden metronome, asking, Mom, are we moving somewhere? Because I've seen your bag sitting at the bottom of the stairs for the past few days." Josie knelt until she was level with her daughter's eyes. She said, "No, sweetheart, we just found the right place." That afternoon, the arched window stood open to Prince Street. Poppy wound up her grandmother's metronome and placed it on the piano lid, and the pendulum began moving back and forth. Click, click, steady and even. Nico sat on the left half of the bench. Josie sat on the other half. 4 hands rested over the keys, though only 2 of those hands were fully uninjured, and they played that nocturne even more slowly than the first time, missed several places in the middle, and neither of them stopped to correct anything. Poppy stood beside them, counting the beat for both adults in her tiny voice. 1, 2, 3, 4, and telling them that Uncle Nico still kept getting half a beat ahead of Mom, but that was all right because everyone did that when they were just learning. There are some things people don't understand until late in life, and one of them is that no one can tune themselves. Every piano needs one true note from outside itself, needs someone willing to sit down at the dinner table and say that we're wrong, needs an ear willing to listen until it finally hears what is out of tune. There are things money can't buy, and the most expensive of them isn't love, but a home filled with sound, with the clatter of dishes, with the voice of a child shouting just to find out how high the ceiling is, and 2 people who have both been broken, if they sit in the right places, can still play an entire piece of music together, even if it's slow, even if they miss a few notes, even if no one would call it beautiful. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can have another meaningful story to listen to. How did you feel about Josie and Nico's story? And which moment stayed with you the most? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family continued good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.